It was supposed to be just another summer afternoon, two children stepping into an elevator, their only thought on the ice cream they were about to get. But what happened next turned that moment of innocence into a nightmare so brutal, so senseless, that it would haunt an entire city for years. June 1, 2014. A day that should have come and gone like any other, but for 6-year-old Prince Joshua Avido and his 7-year-old friend Michaela Capers, it would be their last time stepping into that elevator together. A stranger was already inside, waiting. The doors closed, sealing them in, and within seconds, the horror began. By the time the elevator opened again, one child was left bleeding on the floor, barely clinging to life, the other gone forever. The man who did it? A predator hiding in plain sight. A man who should never have been free to walk the streets. This is the horrifying case of Daniel St. Huber. On June 20, 2014, the air in Brooklyn was thick with the warmth of an early summer afternoon. It was the kind of day meant for children to play outside, their laughter ringing through the courtyards of the Boulevard Houses, a public housing complex in East New York. 6-year-old Prince Joshua PPK, Avido and his 7-year-old best friend Michaela Capers were doing what kids do best, finding joy in the simplest of things. That day their happiness came in the form of a trip to get ice cream, a small but exciting reward marking the unofficial start of summer. The two children were inseparable, bound by an innocent friendship that made them feel invincible in their little world. PJ, a bright and energetic boy with a big smile, had dreams far beyond his years. He loved superheroes, often pretending to be one himself, running through the halls of the apartment building, cape fluttering behind him. Michaela was just as vibrant, a bubbly, kind-hearted girl with an infectious laugh. They had grown up together in the same building, their families close knit like many in the neighborhood. That afternoon their plan was simple: a short trip downstairs, a quick stop at the ice cream truck, and then back to the safety of home. It was a routine so normal that no one gave it a second thought. But normalcy was an illusion, a fragile one that would shatter the moment they stepped into the elevator. The doors slid open, and the children stepped inside, unaware that they were not alone. Inside the small, enclosed space stood a man. He was tall, his figure looming over them. In his hand was something that should not have been there: a knife, a long, gleaming blade that caught the dim light of the elevator. There was no warning, no chance to scream. Before the doors could close completely, the attack began. A flurry of movements, so fast yet so methodical. The blade struck once, twice, over and over again. PJ tried to fight back, a 6-year-old boy against a grown man. He didn't stand a chance. He was stabbed repeatedly, the knife cutting into him with merciless force. His small body collapsed onto the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Michaela, frozen in terror, barely had time to react before the blade turned on her. 16 times it tore through her tiny frame, each wound a mark of cruelty no child should ever endure. The confined space of the elevator turned it into a death trap, each stab echoing off the walls, sealing their fate in horror, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The elevator doors opened, the man was gone. Michaela, barely alive, crawled out of the bloodied space, her small body trembling, pain radiating through her with every shallow breath. Neighbors heard the commotion, their peaceful afternoon shattered by the sight that greeted them. A little girl, drenched in blood, staggering forward, her voice weak but desperate. Help us?" Panic erupted as people rushed to their aid. The smell of blood, thick and metallic, filled the air. Someone screamed. Another neighbor ran to call 911. Mothers grabbed their children, shielding them from the unthinkable scene. PJ lay motionless on the floor of the elevator, his once bright eyes now staring into nothing. He had been stabbed 11 times. His small body had endured the full force of an adult man's rage, and there was nothing anyone could do to bring him back. Paramedics arrived within minutes, their boots tracking through the blood-stained floor as they fought to stabilize Michaela. She was barely clinging to life. Every second mattered. The sirens wailed as they rushed her to the hospital, while the reality of what had happened began to sink into the community. A child was gone, another was fighting to survive, and somewhere out there the man who did this was still free. The news spread fast, the horror rippling through the neighborhood like a shock wave. Parents clutched their children a little tighter, doors were locked. The streets that had once felt safe now carried an unshakable sense of fear. Who could do something like this, and why? As Michaela fought for her life in the hospital, detectives scrambled to find answers. But the truth would be more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. And the worst part? this attack wasn't the first. As the sun dipped below the horizon on that tragic summer evening, casting long shadows over the boulevard houses, the weight of what had just occurred inside that elevator began to sink in. Blood stained the walls, a sickening contrast to the innocent reason two children had stepped inside just moments before. P.J. Avito and Michaela Capers had set out for ice cream, a simple, joyful outing, but had walked straight into the path of a monster. The brutality of the attack was incomprehensible. P.J., just 6 years old, had been stabbed multiple times, his tiny frame unable to withstand the onslaught. Michaela, only a year older, had been stabbed 16 times, but miraculously clung to life, the sheer will to survive keeping her heart beating. The community was shattered. Parents clutched their children tighter. Doors were locked earlier. The once familiar rhythm of life in East New York had been disrupted by a new, gnawing fear. Because whoever had done this was still out there. And as investigators worked tirelessly to unravel the mystery, the truth that began to surface sent an even deeper chill through the city. The man behind the knife was no ghost. He had a name, a face, a past that should have served as a warning long before this tragedy unfolded. His name was Daniel Saint-Hubert, a 27-year-old man with a history drenched in violence. But what made it even worse was the fact that this crime could have been prevented, because just 9 days before he attacked those children, he had been locked away behind bars. For 5 years, St. Hubert had been serving time for a crime that foreshadowed the very horror he would unleash upon PJ and Michaela. He had been convicted of brutally assaulting his own mother, a crime so deeply disturbing that it should have set off every alarm about what he was capable of. The details of that attack painted a harrowing picture of a man who had long been teetering on the edge of complete destruction. It had started with an argument, one that escalated in a matter of seconds. His mother, the woman who had given him life, had seen that darkness in him before, but this time it was different. There was no reasoning with him, no pulling him back from whatever storm raged inside his mind. He snapped. His hands wrapped around her throat, squeezing tighter and tighter as she struggled beneath his grip. She managed to escape, gasping for air, bruises already forming where his fingers had pressed into her skin. That attack should have been a turning point. It should have been a moment where the system intervened, where real steps were taken to ensure that Daniel Saint-Hubert never had the chance to do something even worse. Instead, he was sentenced to 5 years. 5 years that came and went, and then, just like that, he was free again. No parole officer, no mandatory supervision, no one watching where he went or what he did, and within days, the city would pay the price. As investigators traced his movements in the brief window between his release and the attack on the children, what they found was deeply unsettling. Saint-Hubert had been aimless, wandering the streets of Brooklyn with nowhere to go and nothing to lose. Witnesses later recalled seeing him muttering to himself, his eyes wild and unfocused. He would stand outside buildings for long periods, staring into windows as if watching the lives of others unfold before him like a movie he couldn't be a part of. But then something even more horrifying emerged. Just 2 days before the attack on PJ and Michaela, another brutal stabbing had rocked the community. 18-year-old Tanaya Copeland, a promising young woman with a bright future, had been walking near her home when she was attacked out of nowhere. Whoever had come after her hadn't just intended to kill her, they had intended to obliterate her. She had been stabbed over 30 times, her body left in a pool of blood on the pavement. The savagery of the crime had police scrambling for answers, but at the time, they had no suspect, no direction, just fear. And now, with PJ and Michaela's attack mirroring the same level of brutality, investigators couldn't ignore the chilling possibility that the same man had done both. The question that now gripped the city was, if Saint-Hubert was behind both attacks, would he stop there, or was another victim already in his sights? The weight of that uncertainty spread like wildfire. Parents refused to let their children play outside, elderly residents stopped taking their evening walks. Every person who lived in East New York felt the same creeping paranoia that they could be next. As the investigation deepened, so did the frustration over how a man with such a violent past had been allowed back into society with no supervision. The justice system had let him slip through its fingers, and now innocent people were paying the price. The fear was no longer just about the crimes he had already committed. It was about the ones he was still capable of. The city was holding its breath waiting for the next tragedy, because until he was found, nowhere was safe. The air in East New York had changed. It wasn't just grief that lingered. It was fear. A community that had already known struggle, already endured its share of hardship, now found itself paralyzed by something far worse. This was different from the usual dangers of the neighborhood. This was something that slithered beneath the surface, something unpredictable, something that had claimed the life of a child in the most horrifying way imaginable. And the weight of it all bore down hardest on the families at the center of the nightmare. The Avito family had lost their beloved PJ, a bright, joyful 6-year-old, whose only crime had been stepping into an elevator at the wrong time. He had been looking forward to summer, to ice cream, to playing outside with his best friend. Now, his room sat untouched, his toys scattered exactly where he had left them, his absence an unfillable void. His mother, devastated beyond words, would later say that the hardest part was knowing she had sent him downstairs, that she had watched him leave, never imagining for a second that it would be the last time. Just floors away, Michaela Capers lay in a hospital bed, barely clinging to life. She had been stabbed 16 times, an act of pure savagery that should have left no chance of survival. But somehow she was still here. The little girl with the infectious smile, the one who loved to dance and laugh and dream, was now scarred in ways far beyond the physical. She had seen the face of a monster and lived to tell the tale, but she would never be the same. The news spread quickly, reaching every corner of the city. The horror of it all, the innocence of the victims, the senselessness of the attack, ignited a wave of grief and outrage. Vigils sprang up almost immediately. People gathered outside the boulevard houses, candles flickering against the night sky as they whispered prayers for Michaela's recovery and mourned the loss of PJ teddy bears. Flowers and handwritten notes lined the sidewalks, a heartbreaking display of love for a little boy who should have had years ahead of him. But grief alone wasn't enough. The residents of East New York weren't just mourning, they were angry. And that anger quickly turned into something else: demand. Demand for answers, demand for justice, demand for change. How had this happened? How had a man capable of such monstrous violence been allowed to roam free? And more importantly, how could they make sure it never happened again? The questions were endless, and the deeper people dug, the uglier the truth became. The boulevard houses, like many public housing complexes, had long struggled with security issues. The building's front door was supposed to be locked at all times, requiring a key or intercom entry, but the lock had been broken for months. Anyone could walk in and out as they pleased, including a killer. Residents had complained about it repeatedly. They had begged for repairs, for working cameras, for some assurance that their children were safe inside their own homes, but their pleas had gone ignored. And now a 6-year-old was dead. The outrage grew. Community leaders, activists, and even city officials began speaking out, pointing to the attack as a glaring example of the system's failures. If basic security measures had been in place, if someone had listened to the residents, could this have been prevented? The anger was justified, but it did little to erase the horror that had already unfolded. As more details of the case emerged, fear gripped the community even tighter. Whispers spread through the neighborhood. Some people swore they had seen the suspect lurking around in the days leading up to the attack. Others claimed he had been inside the building before, watching, waiting. And the most terrifying part? No one knew where he was now. The police presence in East New York tripled overnight. Officers patrolled the streets, knocking on doors, searching for leads. But for the people who lived there, it wasn't enough. Because until this man was caught, until he was locked away where he could never hurt another child, there was no real safety. Parents no longer let their children play outside. Even trips to the corner store were done in pairs, eyes darting nervously over shoulders. Schools sent out warnings urging families to be cautious. It was as if the entire neighborhood had gone on high alert, trapped in a nightmare that didn't seem to end. But in the midst of all the fear, one truth became painfully clear. PJ Avita would never be forgotten. His face, his name, his story became a rallying cry. His death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a turning point. The community refused to let his murder become just another statistic. His life had meant something, and now, even in death, it would continue to mean something. But as much as the community grieved and fought for change, the reality was this: a killer was still out there, and until he was caught, the nightmare wasn't over. The weight of fear pressed down on East New York like an unbearable storm cloud. Parents kept their children close, unwilling to let them step beyond their sight. Conversations that once revolved around summer plans and neighborhood gossip were now filled with hushed speculations, whispered theories about who this man was and where he might strike next. The police were searching, that much was clear, but how soon would they find him? And more importantly, would they find him before another innocent life was taken? The NYPD wasted no time in ramping up their efforts. Detectives combed through hours of surveillance footage hoping to catch a glimpse of their suspect. Every grainy frame, every flicker of movement was analyzed with painstaking precision. Witnesses were questioned, doors were knocked on, and tensions ran high as law enforcement poured resources into the manhunt. They knew that whoever had committed this crime was dangerous, someone capable of plunging a knife into two small children without hesitation. He wouldn't stop on his own, he had to be stopped. Then, a breakthrough. A set of eyes had caught something. A resident, still shaken from the tragedy, recalled seeing a man pacing near the boulevard houses in the days leading up to the attack. He had a strange energy about him, an unsettling aura that made people instinctively pull their children a little closer. He didn't belong, yet he lingered. As detectives pieced together more accounts, a profile began to take shape. This wasn't a man who had simply snapped in a moment of rage. He had been watching, waiting, and then came the discovery that changed everything. Buried beneath a bush, discarded like an afterthought, lay a bloodied knife. It was a long, brutal weapon, one that spoke of violence even in silence. Forensic teams wasted no time in analyzing it. The results came back swiftly and the findings were undeniable. The blood on the knife belonged to both P.J. Avito and Michaela Capers. But that wasn't all. The weapon also bore traces of something else. DNA that didn't belong to the victim. It belonged to their attacker, and his name was Daniel Saint-Hubert. The moment the name surfaced, the pieces of the puzzle snapped into place with terrifying clarity. Saint-Hubert wasn't an unknown figure. Just 9 days before the attack, he had walked out of prison, a free man after serving time for brutally assaulting his own mother. The idea that a man with such a history had been allowed to re-enter society without strict supervision sent shockwaves through the investigation. Had the system failed yet again? Had the warning signs been ignored? But questions of systemic failure would have to wait. The priority now was finding him before he vanished into the city's shadows. The manhunt intensified. Saint-Hubert's name and face were plastered across news stations, his mugshot seared into the minds of every New Yorker. Police urged the public to remain vigilant. If anyone saw him, if anyone so much as thought they saw him, they were to call 911 immediately. As the search stretched into its third day, fear gave way to desperation. The NYPD's presence in East New York was overwhelming. Officers stationed at nearly every corner, their radios crackling with updates. But Saint-Hubert was nowhere to be found. Each passing hour felt heavier than the last. How was he staying hidden? Where was he getting food, shelter, and worst of all, was he planning another attack? Then, on June 4, 2014, a call came in. A man matching Saint-Hubert's description had been spotted near a fast food restaurant in Queens. It was the lead they had been waiting for. Officers rushed to the scene, their adrenaline surging. They had seen too many cases where suspects slipped away at the last second, and they weren't about to let that happen now. When they arrived, the suspect was walking down the street, seemingly unaware that his time was up. As officers closed in, weapons drawn, he barely resisted. It was almost as if he knew this moment was inevitable. The nightmare that had gripped East New York was finally coming to an end. But as he was taken into custody, one chilling truth remained. There was no remorse in his eyes, no fear, no regret. And as they led him away, the city was left with a haunting question. Was this truly over, or was this just the beginning of something far darker? The arrest of Daniel Saint-Hubert marked the end of a frantic manhunt, but it was far from the conclusion of the nightmare. Justice was still a long road ahead, winding through legal battles, emotional testimonies, and lingering doubts about how someone with such a violent history had been allowed back into society in the first place. For years, the case moved slowly through the system, tangled in delays, legal maneuvering, and psychological evaluations. Saint-Hubert's defense attempted to argue that he was mentally unfit to stand trial, citing his history of schizophrenia and erratic behavior. There were whispers about whether he had been receiving proper psychiatric care after his release from prison, whether the system had simply let him loose without any safety net. But for the families who had suffered the most, none of that changed the reality of what had happened. They wanted justice, they needed it. The trial finally began in 2018, nearly 4 years after the attack. The courtroom was heavy with emotion, the air thick with the weight of grief and anger. Parents clutched tissues, community members sat in tense silence, and the prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Patrick O'Connor, was determined to make sure St. Hubert never walked free again. O'Connor was relentless. He laid out the evidence with chilling precision: how St. Hubert had been released from prison just days before the attack, how he had roamed the area, seemingly stalking his victims. The prosecution presented the murder weapon, the bloodied knife that had been recovered near the crime scene. DNA analysis confirmed what many already believed. The blood of little P.J. Avito and the fingerprints of Daniel St. Hubert were on the same blade. It was undeniable. Then came the most harrowing moment of the trial, the testimony of Michaela Capers. Now older, but forever carrying the scars of that horrifying day, Michaela took the stand with an unfathomable strength that silenced the courtroom. She recounted the attack, her voice trembling but unwavering. She spoke of how the man with the knife had turned their carefree afternoon into a bloodbath, how she had felt the blade pierce her body over and over, how she had watched her best friend PJ collapse beside her, his life slipping away before her eyes. As she spoke, some jurors looked away, unable to meet the raw pain in her gaze. Others stared straight ahead, their expressions steeled with determination. The defense attempted to paint St. Hubert as a victim of his own mind, arguing that he had long suffered from untreated mental illness. They claimed he had no real recollection of the attack, that he had been battling delusions and paranoia. But the prosecution countered swiftly. This wasn't just a case of someone losing control. This was calculated, this was brutal, this was murder. The jury needed only to look at the facts. Then, a damning moment. Security footage from a nearby building. It showed a man, matching St. Hubert's description, wandering near the scene just before the attack, then disappearing in the aftermath. He wasn't confused, he wasn't lost, he had been watching, waiting. The trial lasted for weeks, but when the jury left to deliberate, it didn't take long for them to reach a verdict. Guilty. The words rang through the courtroom, a final, decisive blow that sent a wave of relief through the grieving families. There were tears, some of sorrow, some of justice finally served, but the sentence was yet to come. In May 2018, Daniel St. Hubert was sentenced to 50 years to life in prison. For PJ's family, it was not enough. Nothing would ever bring back the boy they had lost, the future that had been stolen. But at the very least, they knew his killer would never be able to hurt another child again. For Michaela Capers, who had fought so hard to survive, to heal, to stand in that courtroom and confront the man who had tried to take her life, the sentencing was a moment of triumph, but not closure. The wounds ran too deep, the nightmares still too real. The community, once gripped by fear, could finally begin to breathe again. But the questions remained. How had this happened? And how could they make sure it never happened again? Michaela Capers, now a young woman, had survived something no child should ever have to endure. She had fought to reclaim her life, to move forward despite the nightmares that sometimes still crept into her mind. She had stood in a courtroom, faced her attacker, and told the world what he had done. And yet, his death did not erase what had happened to her. It did not bring P.J. Avito back. The Avito family, who had spent years mourning the son, grandson, and nephew they had lost, were left with the same aching absence in their hearts. They had fought for justice, and they had won, but it had never truly been enough. And now, with St. Hubert gone, they were left to wonder, was this justice? Or was it just another chapter of unresolved pain? In the end, Daniel St. Hubert died alone in a prison cell, a place far from the streets where he had once roamed freely. He left behind no legacy, no redemption, only the echoes of a crime that would never be forgotten. This case serves as a grim reminder of how fragile innocence truly is, how violence, when left unchecked, can shatter lives in an instant, and how even when justice is served, the wounds it leaves behind never fully fade. It also raises uncomfortable questions about the failures of the system, about the dangers of releasing individuals without the proper support, and about the lingering trauma that communities are forced to carry long after the headlines disappear. But perhaps the most important lesson of all is this: we must never stop fighting for the safety of our children. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that monsters don't just disappear. They are created, shaped by neglect, by indifference, by a world that sometimes fails to intervene before it's too late. And if we don't learn from stories like this one, we risk allowing history to repeat itself. So now the question is for you, what do you think? Should there be stricter monitoring of released offenders? Should there be better mental health support for those with violent tendencies before they ever get the chance to harm? And more importantly, if you believe that children should never be killed for fun, subscribe to the channel. Only those who believe children should be killed for fun won't subscribe.